Welcome back to Neural Battlefields, where we explore the most pivotal conflicts that shaped human civilization. Today, we're diving into one of the most consequential upheavals in modern history, a revolution that didn't just topple an empire, it rewrote the rules of political power, transformed the lives of millions, and sent shockwaves across the entire world. This is the story of the Russian Revolution, and I promise you, the truth behind it is far more complex and disturbing than most people realize. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by history's turning points and the ideologies that drive them, make sure you're subscribed to Neural Battlefields. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the conflicts that define our world. Now, let's step back to the winter of 1917, when the largest empire on Earth was about to shatter. February 1917, Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire. Temperatures plunge below freezing. Bread lines stretch for blocks. Women stand in the snow for hours, waiting for rations that may never come. The city is starving. The empire is bleeding. And the man who rules over 1/6 of the world's land surface, Tsar Nicholas II, seems utterly oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding beneath his throne. But to understand how Russia reached this breaking point, we need to go back further, because the Russian Revolution wasn't born in February 1917. It was decades in the making, the inevitable result of contradictions so deep they would eventually tear the empire apart. Russia in the early 20th century was a land of extremes that defied logic. On one end, you had the opulence of the imperial court, where nobles dined on French cuisine served on golden plates while discussing philosophy and art. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg contained over 1,500 rooms, a symbol of wealth and power that seemed eternal. On the other end, you had workers living in barracks called corners, literally corners of rooms they shared with multiple families, where disease spread like wildfire and children grew up knowing nothing but poverty. This wasn't just inequality. This was a chasm between two different worlds existing in the same country. Russia was an autocracy ruled by divine right, where the Tsar's word was absolute law, where dissent was crushed by the Okhrana, the secret police, and where political prisoners were routinely exiled to Siberia. Yet it was also rapidly industrializing, particularly after the 1890s under the drive of Finance Minister Sergei Witte. Factories sprouted in Moscow and St. Petersburg, railways stretched across the vast empire, and foreign capital poured in. But this industrialization came at a terrible human cost. The new urban working class, drawn from peasant villages by the promise of wages, found themselves trapped in conditions that can only be described as hellish. Imagine this. You're a worker in a textile factory in 1905. You wake up at 4 in the morning in a crowded, freezing dormitory. You work a 12 to 14-hour shift, sometimes longer in a factory with no safety regulations, where accidents maim or kill workers regularly and the owner simply hires replacements. You earn barely enough to buy bread and pay rent. You have no right to organize, no right to strike, no representation in government. One wrong word to the wrong person, and you could find yourself jobless, blacklisted, or worse, arrested by the Okhrana. And if you got sick or injured, there was no workers' compensation, no health care, nothing. Your family starved. This was the reality for millions of people, and it created a rage that simmered beneath the surface of Russian society, waiting for an outlet. Meanwhile, the vast majority of Russia's population, over 80%, were peasants tied to the land. Now you might think, well, at least they're in the countryside, working the land. Surely that's better than factory life. But the Russian peasantry in the early 1900s lived in conditions that hadn't fundamentally changed in centuries. Serfdom had been abolished in 1861. Yes, but emancipation had been a cruel joke. Peasants received land, but they had to pay redemption payments for it that stretched over decades. The land they got was often poor quality and insufficient to support their growing families. They worked using medieval agricultural techniques. Wooden plows, sickles for harvesting, no mechanization, no fertilizer, and they owed obligations to the village commune, the mir, which controlled land distribution and kept peasants tied to their villages almost as effectively as serfdom had. Add to this high taxes, periodic famines, and the constant presence of landlords who still owned vast estates while peasants struggled on tiny plots, and you have another powder keg. These weren't just economic problems. They were existential crises for millions of people. When your child is starving and you watch the landlord's grain stores overflow, when you work yourself to death and still can't feed your family, when the government offers no relief and actively suppresses any attempt to organize or protest, something breaks inside. The human capacity for endurance is remarkable, but it has limits. Russia in the early 20th century was testing those limits. That spark came in the form of World War I, and it didn't just ignite the powder keg, it created an inferno that consumed everything. In August 1914, Russia entered the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Tsar believed it would unite his fractured empire in patriotic fervor, that the external enemy would make people forget their internal grievances. For a brief moment, he seemed right. Massive crowds gathered in St. Petersburg, which was hastily renamed Petrograd because Petersburg sounded too German. Men volunteered by the hundreds of thousands, marching off to war with icons and prayers, believing they were defending Holy Russia. But the illusion shattered almost immediately. The Russian army was the largest in the world, capable of fielding millions of men, a human wave that should have been unstoppable. But size meant nothing against modern warfare. The German army was smaller but infinitely better organized, better equipped, and better led. Russian generals, many appointed for their aristocratic connections rather than military competence, sent wave after wave of soldiers into German machine gun fire and artillery barrages. The disaster of Tannenberg in August 1914 should have been a warning. 2 entire Russian armies were encircled and destroyed, with over 170,000 casualties in a single battle. But the warning went unheeded. The carnage continued, month after month, year after year. Russian soldiers went to the front without rifles, literally waiting for their comrades to die so they could pick up their weapons. They faced German machine guns with courage that bordered on the superhuman. But courage doesn't stop bullets when you don't even have a gun to fire back. Artillery shells, rationed, medical supplies, almost non-existent, food, sporadically delivered, often rotted by the time it reached the trenches. And this wasn't because Russia lacked resources. It was because the logistics system was incompetent, because corruption was rampant, because no one in the high command seemed to understand or care about the practical needs of soldiers dying in the mud. The casualty figures are almost impossible to process. By 1917, Russia had lost nearly 2 million men killed, with another 5 million wounded and 2.5 million captured. Think about that. In less than 3 years, Russia had suffered more casualties than the entire population of some European countries. And these weren't just statistics. Every death was a son, a father, a husband who would never return. Every village in Russia was in mourning. But the suffering wasn't confined to the trenches. The war utterly shattered the Russian economy. Factories that should have been producing consumer goods were converted to war production, making shells and rifles that were lost or destroyed almost as fast as they could be made. The railway system, never adequate even in peacetime, collapsed under the strain of moving troops and supplies. This meant food couldn't get from the countryside to the cities. Inflation exploded. By 1917, prices were 4 times higher than they'd been in 1914, but wages hadn't kept pace. People who'd been poor before the war were now literally starving. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Women stood in the freezing cold for hours, sometimes all night, hopping to buy bread, only to be told the bakery had run out. Coal shortages meant people froze in their apartments. Factories shut down because they couldn't get fuel or raw materials. And through all of this, the aristocracy, the people who'd sent these soldiers to die, who'd created this disaster through their incompetence, they continued living in luxury. They held balls and dinner parties while soldiers froze in trenches and workers starved in bread lines. The disconnect was so complete, so obscene, that it radicalized even moderate people who'd never thought about revolution before. And then there was Nicholas himself, a man tragically unsuited for the role history had thrust upon him. He was stubborn, believing absolutely in his divine right to rule, yet he was also indecisive and easily influenced, particularly by his wife, Alexandra, and the infamous mystic, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's hold over the royal family, stemming from his apparent ability to ease the suffering of their hemophiliac son, became a scandal that further eroded what little respect remained for the monarchy. By February 1917, the situation was unsustainable. On February 23, International Women's Day, women textile workers in Petrograd walked out on strike demanding bread. This wasn't planned as a revolution, it was a desperate plea for survival, but the strike spread. Workers from other factories joined. Students joined. The demonstrations grew. Within days, hundreds of thousands filled the streets, and the slogans changed from "Give us bread" to "Down with the autocracy." The Tsar's response was predictable. He ordered the military to suppress the protests, but here's where everything changed. The soldiers, many of them peasants and workers themselves, refused to fire on the crowds. Regiment after regiment mutinied, joining the protesters instead of dispersing them. The government lost control of its own capital. On March 2nd, Nicholas abdicated, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. The February Revolution was over in a matter of days, and it happened almost bloodlessly. But this is where our story takes its darkest turn, because the fall of the Tsar didn't bring freedom and democracy to Russia. Instead, it created a power vacuum that would be filled by forces far more ruthless and systematic in their application of violence and control than the old regime had ever been. After Nicholas's abdication, two centers of power emerged. The first was the provisional government, made up primarily of liberal politicians from the old Duma, Russia's parliament. They promised democratic elections, civil liberties, and continued commitment to the war effort. The second was the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers' deputies that represented the revolutionary masses. This dual power structure was inherently unstable, and into this chaos stepped a man who would change the course of history: Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had spent years in exile, developing his revolutionary theory and building his faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, the Bolsheviks. His ideology was based on Karl Marx's theories, but adapted for Russian conditions. Lenin believed that revolution couldn't wait for capitalism to fully develop in Russia. Instead, a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries must seize power on behalf of the working class and impose socialism from above. This wasn't democracy as we understand it. This was the dictatorship of the proletariat, and Lenin meant dictatorship literally. When Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917, famously in a sealed train provided by the Germans who hoped he would destabilize their enemy, he immediately began pushing for a second revolution. His April theses shocked even his fellow Bolsheviks with their radicalism. All power to the Soviets, immediate end to the war, land to the peasants, and no cooperation with the provisional government. It was a brilliant political strategy because it spoke directly to what the masses wanted most: peace, bread, and land. Throughout 1917, the provisional government stumbled from crisis to crisis. They continued the war, which was catastrophically unpopular. They delayed land reform, alienating the peasants. They failed to address food shortages, keeping the cities on the edge of starvation. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, though still a minority, were organized, disciplined, and had a clear message that resonated. By October, the Bolsheviks had gained control of the Petrograd Soviet, and Lenin judged the moment right. He'd been pushing for insurrection for weeks, writing frantic letters from hiding, accusing his more cautious colleagues of betraying the revolution. On the night of October 25th, Bolshevik forces, coordinated by Leon Trotsky, who'd brilliantly organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, seized key points throughout Petrograd. Bridges, telephone exchanges, railway stations, power plants, and finally the Winter Palace where the provisional government sat. The October Revolution, unlike the February uprising, was a calculated coup d'état. It was swift, relatively bloodless in its initial phase, with perhaps a handful of casualties in the actual seizure of power. The famous storming of the Winter Palace, later mythologized in Soviet films as a heroic assault, was actually more of a gradual infiltration. The palace was barely defended. Ministers of the provisional government sat in a room debating what to do, while Bolshevik forces simply walked through poorly guarded entrances. When they were finally arrested, it was almost anticlimactic. But don't let the ease of the initial takeover fool you. This was the moment everything changed, the moment when power fell into the hands of people who had a complete, systematic vision for remaking society from the ground up. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to change the government. They wanted to eliminate private property, destroy the old ruling classes, create a new economy, forge a new culture, even create a new type of human being unburdened by the old world's prejudices and superstitions. And they were absolutely convinced that they alone understood how history worked, that they were the instruments of inevitable progress, and that any resistance to them was resistance to history itself. This certainty, this absolute conviction that they were right and everyone else was wrong, made them capable of justifying anything. And I mean anything. Lenin moved with breathtaking speed to consolidate power. Within days, he issued the decree on peace, calling for an immediate end to the war without annexations or reparations. He issued the decree on land, technically recognizing peasant seizures of landlord estates that were already happening across the countryside. These moves were politically brilliant because they gave people what they desperately wanted, creating support for the Bolshevik regime. But simultaneously, Lenin began dismantling every institution that could challenge Bolshevik power. Freedom of the press, abolished. Opposition newspapers were shut down, their printing presses seized. Political parties. The Constitutional Democrats were banned almost immediately, their leaders arrested. The socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks were tolerated briefly but increasingly harassed. And then came the ultimate betrayal of democracy. The provisional government had promised elections to a constituent assembly that would write a constitution and determine Russia's future. The Bolsheviks, despite opposing the provisional government, had demanded these elections happen. So the elections went forward in November 1917, the freest and most democratic elections in Russian history up to that point. And the results were a disaster for the Bolsheviks. The socialist revolutionaries won a clear majority with about 40% of the vote. The Bolsheviks received only about 24%, even less in rural areas. The message was clear. Given a free choice, the Russian people did not want Bolshevik rule. Lenin's response revealed everything about what Bolshevik ideology really meant in practice. When the Constituent Assembly met on January 18, 1918, Bolshevik guards were stationed throughout the hall. The assembly refused to accept Bolshevik dictates, so after one day, Lenin simply dissolved it by force. Let that sink in. The Bolsheviks claimed to represent the workers and peasants, but when the workers and peasants voted against them in free elections, the Bolsheviks dissolved the elections and took power anyway. This wasn't democracy. This wasn't even a dictatorship of the proletariat. This was the dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party, and increasingly the dictatorship of Lenin himself. Then came the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, where Lenin agreed to massive territorial concessions to Germany to secure peace. Russia lost Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and other territories, about a third of its population and agricultural land. This treaty was so humiliating that it triggered the Russian Civil War, a conflict that would make the revolution itself look tame by comparison. The Civil War, lasting from 1918 to 1922, was a nightmare of unimaginable brutality. On one side were the Reds, the Bolsheviks and their supporters. On the other were the Whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, socialists who opposed the Bolsheviks and separatist movements. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, intervened on the side of the Whites, fearing the spread of communism. But here's what makes this period so significant for understanding totalitarian control. It was during the Civil War that the Bolsheviks developed and perfected the mechanisms of terror and repression that would define Soviet rule. In December 1917, Lenin created the Cheka, the secret police, under Felix Dzerzhinsky. The Cheka's mandate was to eliminate counter-revolutionaries by any means necessary, and Dzerzhinsky interpreted this broadly. The Cheka pioneered what Lenin called Red Terror, systematic violence against entire social classes. If you were a former nobleman, a priest, a wealthy merchant, or even just someone accused of being sympathetic to the whites, you could be arrested, imprisoned, or executed without trial. The numbers are staggering and still debated by historians, but estimates suggest the Cheka executed at least 50,000 to 200,000 people during the Civil War, with many more dying in labor camps or from famine. And speaking of famine, the Civil War saw another horrifying Bolshevik policy, war communism. To feed the Red Army and the cities, the Bolsheviks requisitioned grain from peasants at gunpoint, often taking everything and leaving them to starve. When peasants resisted or hid their grain, they faced brutal reprisals. Entire villages were burned, hostages were taken and executed, and anyone suspected of hoarding food was treated as an enemy of the revolution. The result was catastrophic famine, particularly in 1921 to 1922, that killed an estimated 5 million people. Think about that number. More people died from famine, a famine largely caused by Bolshevik policies, than had died in combat during the entire Civil War. And this wasn't an accident or an unintended consequence. Lenin and his lieutenants knew people were starving, but they prioritized ideology and control over human life. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're discussing here. This wasn't just political violence in the heat of civil war, though that was terrible enough. This was the systematic application of ideology to remake society, regardless of the human cost. The Bolsheviks genuinely believed they were creating a better world, a socialist paradise where exploitation would end and everyone would be equal. But to achieve this utopia, they were willing to eliminate anyone who stood in the way, and their definition of who stood in the way kept expanding. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, but Russia was devastated. The economy had collapsed, industrial production had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels, and millions were dead from war, terror, and famine. Lenin, facing reality, temporarily retreated from pure socialist economics with the new economic policy, allowing some private enterprise, but there was no retreat from political control. The Communist Party, as the Bolsheviks now called themselves, had established a one-party state with total power. Here's what makes this revolution so significant for world history. It wasn't just about Russia. The Bolsheviks created a new model of political organization and control that would be copied, with variations, by totalitarian movements across the 20th century. They showed that a small, disciplined, ideologically committed group could seize power in a moment of chaos, and then use systematic terror and propaganda to maintain that power indefinitely. They pioneered the concept of the party as the sole legitimate voice of the people, even when the actual people disagreed. They developed sophisticated propaganda techniques to control information and shape public opinion. They created a system where ideology trumped reality, where economic laws, human nature, and basic facts could be ignored if they conflicted with party doctrine. And they normalized political violence to a degree that would have shocked even autocratic regimes of the past. When Lenin died in 1924, he left behind a system that his successor, Joseph Stalin, would take to even more horrifying extremes. Stalin's forced collectivization, his purges, the Gulag system, the Ukrainian Holodomor famine, these weren't departures from Lenin's revolution. They were the logical extensions of the principles and methods the Bolsheviks had established during the Revolution and Civil War. The human cost of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath is almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates vary, but between the Civil War, the Red Terror, the famines, and the subsequent Stalin era, somewhere between 20 to 60 million people died as a direct or indirect result of Bolshevik policies. And this doesn't even account for the suffering of those who survived in labor camps, in internal exile, or under constant surveillance and fear. But the impact went far beyond Russia's borders. The revolution inspired communist movements worldwide, leading to revolutions in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and numerous other countries. In every case, the pattern was similar: a promise of equality and liberation, followed by the establishment of a one-party state, systematic repression of opposition, and the willingness to sacrifice millions of lives for ideological goals. The 20th century's bloodiest conflicts and worst humanitarian disasters can be traced, in large part, to the model the Russian Revolution created. Yet here's what's most disturbing: the true believers in this system genuinely thought they were building a better world. Lenin wasn't a monster who delighted in suffering. He was an intellectual who believed, with absolute certainty, that he understood the laws of history and that temporary violence and dictatorship were necessary to achieve ultimate human freedom. That's what makes ideology so dangerous. When people believe they possess ultimate truth and are building a perfect future, they can justify any level of violence in the present. The Russian Revolution teaches us several crucial lessons. First, revolutions rarely deliver what they promise. The people who made the February Revolution wanted bread, peace, and democratic rights. What they got was civil war, famine, and the most repressive state in Russian history. Second, ideology, when taken to its logical extreme, is inherently dangerous because it values abstract principles over concrete human lives. Third, power concentrated in the hands of a single party or leader, no matter how noble their stated intentions, inevitably leads to tyranny. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: we must be deeply suspicious of anyone who promises to create heaven on earth, especially if they're willing to use force to get there. Every totalitarian movement in history has justified its atrocities as necessary steps toward a better future. The Russian Revolution showed us where that logic leads, and the bodies are still being counted. As we close this chapter of Neural Battlefields, I want you to think about how relevant these lessons remain today. The specific ideology may change, the technology may advance, but the fundamental patterns of how movements gain power, consolidate control, and justify violence in the name of higher ideals, these patterns persist. Understanding the Russian Revolution isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing the warning signs of totalitarianism, wherever and whenever they appear. If this deep dive into one of history's most consequential events has expanded your understanding, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves history, and subscribe to Neural Battlefields for more explorations of the conflicts that shaped our world. Drop a comment below telling me what aspect of the Russian Revolution you'd like to explore further, or what other ideological conflicts you think we should cover. Remember, the battlefields of ideas are just as important as the battlefields of war, and here at Neural Battlefields, we're committed to understanding both. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.